Get started then. Could someone close the door, please? Thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone. This event is hosted by the Project for the Study of the 21st Century, which is a think tank that was founded by Reuters correspondent Peter Apps. Unfortunately, Peter is still in London and can't join us tonight, but he will be watching the recording, I'm sure. For those of you who are tweeting about the event, our hashtag is hashtag PS21Culture, so feel free to tag all of your tweets with that. I'm joined by some great panelists. On my right is Alyssa Rosenberg, who writes about pop culture for the Washington Post's opinions section. Previously, she was the culture editor at Think Progress and a correspondent for TheAtlantic.com, among other positions. Originally from Massachusetts, Alyssa received her BA in Humanities from Yale, and her writing's been featured in the New York Times, the Daily Beast, the New Republic, Salon, and many other notable publications.
It's very comprehensive.
We wanted to hit all the high points. To my left is Mr. Max Lazarovich. He is the Senior Experience Designer at Include, spelled N-C-L-U-D, a creative design agency in DC. He focuses on design and concepting for clients that range from startups to Fortune 100 companies, and he uses background in political science and programming to do various art that includes topics on surveillance, deception, and generative art. And some of you may know him through Twitter accounts that he's started that speak to the many cameras that are around the city and capture moments in daily DC life, which I've always found fascinating. My name is Milena Rodban, and I'm a global fellow with PS21. I'm also a geopolitical risk consultant and a simulation designer. I work with private companies to design immersive experiences to help them navigate complicated business and security environments. And I got my graduate degree at Georgetown. So we're going to jump into a couple of introductory remarks by these great panelists, and then we'll launch into some questions. I anticipate about 20 minutes of discussion or so, and then I'll open the floor to everybody. So think of all your great questions, and please don't be shy. Alyssa, we'll start with you.
I think that one of the most useful frameworks for thinking about the Trump administration is actually to consider it a piece of popular culture. We're looking at a president of the United States who, while he was certainly famous in the New York region and was a staple of mass culture in terms of making lots of cameos that sort of presented him as a stand-in for a certain kind of wealth and power and sex appeal stemming from New York City, really became a national figure through a reality television show, and who still runs his public life essentially according to the rules of reality television and sort of the tropes that govern the genre. And so trying to look at the administration through a political frame, I think, is a very limited sort of conceit, and it's useful to think about what we're witnessing and to a certain extent all participating in as a cultural phenomenon. That is perhaps the most extreme example of the idea that politics is downstream from culture, but it, I think, is a way to reframe what's happening, not necessarily in a way that's more comforting, but certainly in a way that allows us to read the president's motivations and his way of dealing with the media differently. So that's something I've been thinking about a great deal lately.
Okay, great. Max?
For me, if somebody would have asked me to define pop culture, 6 months ago, it would have been a little bit more straightforward than today, obviously. I find myself at a loss almost defining that as like a definition formally because of what's going on. It's very hard to hear anybody have a conversation without invoking Trump or any member of his cabinet, which is weird to me. And so, to me, I found it healthy for me to think about the climate and the presidency and politics as symptomatic of things that have been happening and are going to continue to happen socially, as opposed to really examining them, because I think looking any deeper than we need to at any personality or word choice is just going to either make you angry or make you stay in the weeds for too long.
So you kind of framework, can I just
Yeah,
ask you,
please.
because this is really interesting to me. I think that I find using the tropes of pop culture and the tropes of reality television in particular to understand the administration makes me feel like I understand what's happening in a clearer way. It fits into a schema, but it doesn't necessarily make me feel comforted by what's happening in American politics right now, where it sounds like to a certain extent that framework allows you to distance yourself a little bit, or at least not get caught up in the idea that there's some sort of Machiavellian scheme taking
Right.
place. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would actually agree with that fully. There's a little part of me that's like, there is some Machiavellian conspiracy theory like undercurrent that's like, you know, hidden in plain sight. I try to kill that part of me on a daily basis, so I don't actually believe that, but I think I would definitely think that that helps just deal and also understand.
Because I think there's a way of looking at the administration that frames it, oh, it's just pop culture, the stakes are low, it's entertainment, it's fine. And then a way of looking at it goes, oh my god, it's pop culture. And the rules and checks and balances and norms that have normally constrained politicians suddenly seem to no longer apply in a way that is disconcerting. And so I think there's a way of, you can look at the administration as pop culture and be distanced and relieved, and look at it as pop culture and be just completely panicked.
I don't know, for instance, how to look at politics and not consider pop culture, particularly like, because I think it's only been a little bit, but I think like so much of our daily, like anything from memes to sound bites to moods to just like phrases that are get passed around, just even outside of social media, are so dictated by this administration.
But isn't there a difference between politics being a source of material for pop culture, you know, Bill Clinton eating hamburgers or playing the saxophone, or George Bush being fodder for the Daily Show and the Colbert Report, and an administration that operates entirely according to the rules of pop culture, or in fact seems to see itself as, as its primary function, sort of running the media cycle and sort of being part of media itself? I mean, it seems like the memification of the presidency is something that's been underway for longer than people have been slapping up Pepe avatars on their Twitter feeds, but it's somewhat different to have politics be operating so entirely by the rule of media.
Well, but then that begs the whole, like, the ongoing chant, which is like, don't normalize this. I mean, in order for us to decouple it from like being pop culture and being from the panicky swirl of the day to becoming, getting stuff done in politics, we then have to accept it as politics. And I feel like, at least in like some groups of people are like they need to treat it in this heightened state of abnormality in order for it to not sort of be forgotten or out of the
That's really interesting. I hadn't seen someone make the connection between sort of the refusal to normalize and the insistence on seeing the administration as a cultural product. But that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Let's take a second to define pop culture. Is there a clear definition? Has the definition changed since the advent of social media? Where is sort of the line? It used to be pop culture was sort of art for the masses, basically, right?
I think and I don't know that definition has necessarily changed. Just it's a question of what art is, right? I mean, when you have people using Twitter to tell stories about a fictionalized version of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, then Twitter's pop culture, right? I mean, it's not necessarily something that's going in, the medium of modern art, but it's entertaining, it unspools over a period of time. So I think it's not necessarily popular or culture that's shifted its definition. It's, I guess it's culture or art or whatever the sort of operative noun is there.
So the advent of new media has led to a change in how pop culture is created or disseminated.
Well, I think it's a new medium, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's social media it literally is a medium,
right?
And so, I think that's an interesting and slippery question. Again, because the administration is playing by the rules of reality television, are Sean Spicer's press briefings a form of pop culture? I mean, it's a sort of malleable. We exist in a malleable state, especially if we feel like the line between what's real and what's serious, and what's a government function, and what is just a pure media spectacle is being blurred.
I mean, I'm not going to try and define it because I will fail. But like, there's a paraphrased version of the story, which is like memes or things that, start becoming part of our culture with varying intervals. Like the adage is like, they are born on 4chan or Reddit. They start being popularized on Twitter, they go to Facebook to sort of retire, then they end up on Instagram to die, right? And each one of those networks has a wider and differing audience, so by the time you go through all of them, you have almost every engaged person who has internet access.
Well, that doesn't even include World Star, like the sort of subculture of Black Twitter. Memes
Yeah.
have so many generative points. Is it worth, for the purposes of discussion, defining what a meme is? I don't know if you want to take the first stab at it.
You may fail at that too.
I will also, because I feel like that's changed. Like, so much to me has changed in the last year, where we were relying on a lot of definitions in common. Like, everything that we have thought was fairly solid is sort of not so much anymore. So, like, to me, a meme is a obviously a visual piece or a piece of language that has spread, and its meaning is brought on with it. Like, it's not taken at face value. It has some sort of meaning or humor that speaks to its context, whether politically, socially, or time-wise.
I also think, to take a sort of Nazi frog avatar example, is everyone here familiar with the sort of icon has cheeseburger, like internet joke? It's like, starts as a picture of a cat, sort of overweight looking cat, has some text superimposed on it. And so a meme, that's a great example of a meme because it's, I'm trying to think of sort of a great way to explain this. I've walked into my own trap, clearly. But it's an image paired with text that has a meaning that sort of originates from the subculture that created it, but it also becomes a game that people can play, right? It is a way of telling a joke that people can sort of repurpose and put in new context. They can use new images, they can use new text, but it almost becomes sort of a form. If a sitcom is defined as a comedy that's 30 minutes long, a meme might be defined by an image with text, and then you can tell that something is a specific meme the same way that you can tell that an episode of 30 Rock is an episode of 30 Rock. It has the same characters, it has the same linguistic style, and so. But instead of being run by a showrunner, it's something that's sort of out there. It's a form that's out there for everybody to play with. Is that a reasonable?
Yeah. I think actually the meme to me has become the convergence point for pop culture. That's where I'll stop saying that phrase, even though it's independent. Like, from all sides of the political spectrum, and whether it's art on one side and sort of sad Pepe the Frog type stuff on the other side, like all of it sort of crystallizes and takes its final form in the form of these memes, whether they're pictures or even just the phrase alternative facts. There's no picture that goes to that, maybe it's Kellyanne Conway. But the phrase itself now stands on its own 2 scary feet. So like the reason for me that like memes have become that linchpin is because they used to be funny. Like for most part, it was like a haha thing. Then they became sort of emotional, like in these broad strokes, like reaction memes, like celebrity gifs of celebrities rolling their eyes, stuff like that.
I assume a lot of you have seen an image of Michael Jordan in tears that's been sort of repurposed in other contexts. The sort of like the crying Jordan meme is a really good example of a celebrity reaction shot that's been sort of repurposed as a stand-in for. It's if you use the image of Jordan in tears, it becomes a way to signal that someone is having a strong reaction. You find that reaction sort of funny, or you're potentially overreacting, or that the reaction is silly or inappropriate in some way. So it becomes a sort of a linguistic shorthand. And part of what happened in the election this year, are people familiar with the Pepe the Frog?
I've got a picture.
Okay, raise your hand if you're familiar with Pepe the Frog. We won't judge you. Okay, so we don't actually have to do a big, extensive. But this is like, a sort of like crudely drawn cartoon character who was adopted by members of the alt-right and became this sort of symbol, and illustrated. I think part of what was not funny about this particular meme is that it had been adopted by people who espoused white nationalist or anti-Semitic views, but it also was something that had been created by someone else, kind of taken from the creator and used entirely outside of its original context. And so, while the playful aspect of memes and the sort of collaborative aspect of them was part of the fun, previously, this was a case where, you know, an artist who has nothing to do with the alt-right or with white nationalism was suddenly sort of had his work kind of taken away from him and had the meaning of it changed. And so something like that, I think, makes that sort of collaborative and malleable aspect of memes feel less like a game and a little bit more like a theft.
I have two questions to jump off of that. So would you agree, both of you, that this election was the first time that memes became a way for people to self-identify as part of a group politically, as opposed to previously when it was just them being part of, you know,
I
some
don't know
sort of
about that. I
movement?
mean, I think the sort of text from Hillary meme was a way for people to signal sort of lingering affection for Hillary Clinton, and was kind of seized on by her campaign to, you know, sort of maintain the sort of sense of warm feeling that she'd gotten after she lost the 2008 presidential election. I'm trying to think what the big memes were in sort of 2008 and 2012.
Well, 2008 and 2012 were sort of mostly characterized by this type of imagery, which everybody saw, right? Everybody saw this type of imagery, and people made their profile pictures in this style to signal their support.
It's true, but I think you also had the sort of jokes about Sarah Palin, and to a certain extent that was a little more wedded to traditional media. I mean, so much of Sarah Palin's lingering public image, at least in certain circles, is the sort of "I can see Russia from my house" line, which is something that she never actually said, that Tina Fey said on Saturday Night Live while playing her, and that became sort of superimposed over her actual image. So I think there were, you know, I mean, the Howard Dean scream during the primaries in 2004 is, I think, that wasn't necessarily something that Dean supporters or critics used as a way of identifying themselves, but I don't think that, I mean, I think, again, the sort of memification of the presidency has been underway for a while.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the memes, however they've been expressed, have always been present. I think we're at peak meme. I think it'll be very, like, if you look historically, it'll be hard to see, like, I don't want to talk about liberalism or conservatism, but, like, you remember in 2008 and 12, a lot of Obama stuff, mostly in a positive light. I think now for the first time, the playing field is a little bit more saturated with the other side, the conservative side of, you know, who controls the media and all that other sort of subtext and conversation. So I do think that that has changed. And I do think that, like, the Shepard Fairey print of Obama that we all know, and I think maybe hate by now because we've seen it so much, it was originally a piece of art. It was originally a piece of expression that then got memified and became that, which is why, like, when he did the new one for the Women's March, same style, but with a Muslim woman, I think a couple other ones, like, to me, it, like, when I first saw it, it still looked good as art, but, like, as a political tool, it lost its edge, at least to me, and it felt over, like, it was very dated. So I think, like, Pepe the Frog was also a huge turning point because it's the first sort of anti-meme. It's the first meme that wallows in indifference and wallows in
Well, and also it
objectively
being
negative
bad
things.
art to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's essentially like a Microsoft Paint image. It's not intended to have high aesthetic value, which to a certain extent is also, you know, a high expression of the style of memes, right? Which are often, if you go back to the sort of iconized cheeseburger, it's, you know, bad Photoshop text over, you know, sort of not very good looking cat pictures. So the sort of the bad art element of memes in this election, I think, is really interesting.
So what do you think about the fact that social media empowers anybody, anywhere, to create something that can take over the political discussion in the country?
Remember when the Arab Spring happened and Twitter was going to be like this great, marvelous force for democracy and everything was going to be the best? I mean, I think the thing to remember about Twitter and other social media tools is that they in and of themselves are neutral, right? I mean, they may not, they may have unintended consequences and evolve in ways that become, and their, you know, ostensibly neutral policies may create spaces that are more hospitable to people who are willing to break certain norms or behave in certain ways, but the tools are themselves fundamentally.
Would you still agree with that, even despite Milo's banishment from Twitter and Richard Spencer continues to tweet?
I mean,
people?
I think if anything that illustrates the problems that Twitter has faced in coming up with sort of rules based in first principles that make sense, right? I mean, what's happening, I mean, I have no problem with Milo Yiannopoulos not being on Twitter. That doesn't seem to me to be a major loss for humanity. but he was banned on sort of a case-by-case basis, right? There isn't a clear underlying principle that, you know, and clearly Twitter doesn't apply these rules in consistent ways. Essentially, the only consistent rule of Twitter banishment is that if you come after someone prominent enough and it becomes a problem for Twitter, then you might get booted off the service. But, you know, if anything, that is, his banning is an example of Twitter acting sort of preferentially in a case-by-case basis, not based on neutral rules. I mean, neutral rules can have highly specific consequences, but I mean, I don't think, you know, Twitter or Tumblr wasn't founded to be a service for social justice teams. It just works really well as sort of an image sharing service and has developed those communities over time. Twitter wasn't developed to be a white nationalist harassment forum. It just happened to have system architecture and trouble enforcing its rules that means that it functions that way sometimes. So, I mean, I think that I mean, I have a hard time saying, I would not be particularly comfortable making sort of an overarching statement about social media and whether it's a force for good or evil in the world. I think that the optimism about social media that might have existed 10 years ago has dissipated, and that's probably a pretty healthy thing, not least because sort of tech industry triumphalism has plenty of unintended consequences of its own.
Max, you sort of represent the design community professionally, and what are your thoughts on the fact that so many sort of organic memes that just anybody created who doesn't necessarily have a job in graphic design can take over a moment, you know, in moments, whereas the very carefully curated content sometimes falls very flat?
Let me give you a half answer from my perspective.
Sure.
I do think that memes no longer, and really maybe never, had to have any intrinsic aesthetic value or necessarily artistic value.
Mm-hmm.
That certainly helps. Like, I think you had artists making stuff that made a statement or maybe didn't, and you have sort of regular folks making stuff that maybe had meaning as well, and sort of from both sides. I think the problem is that, like, now, like, it's very hard to, at least in artist groups, to see art that doesn't some way now have a political statement or slant or angle or an anti-Trump thing or an anti-truth thing, or like it is infested, at least the art world, at least the, you know, the ones who would be contributing to memes and things like that. The ones who are doing poster shows in New York and Brooklyn, the ones who are running, you know, closed group societies where they're, you know, doing visual riffs and things like that. That's just Trump 24/7. It's Trump Nation. So in a sense, like, that is no longer viable, and so I think at the regular people who take a screenshot from a TV show and put it on Giphy.com, or who put a funny bit of text or a new word or something, or even slap it on a t-shirt, like, that certainly has democratized the meme creation process, but like, that is almost completely decoupled from aesthetics, unless the ugliness of it is meant ironically.
Well, and certainly, you know, I mean, I think so much of what makes memes work is comedy, and comedy isn't necessarily aesthetically beautiful, right? I mean, one of the great democratizing things about comedy is that Louis C.K. doesn't have to look like a Hemsworth brother in order to tell really funny jokes. And so, I mean, a lot of the aesthetic, and comedy is an aesthetic value, so a lot of the aesthetic value of memes is comedic rather than necessarily visual. But part of that, I think, can be the use of sort of deliberate ugliness, or shoddiness, or, you know, kind of hackneyedness.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, like, we're talking about memes a lot, and, like, I actually think that it goes beyond that. I don't mean to make any broad, like, sweeping statements. Like, for example, Twitter and Facebook, to me, they are trains that are already off a cliff, and it's too late. Like, if you make a change, like, if their leadership makes a change to their fundamental principles of how they operate, it's not going to help. They're already sort of on a momentum. To me, I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's like, the internet was the first thing that man created they couldn't understand. Twitter's the first news and media platform and art platform that we created that we have no idea what to do with. no idea how to regulate it. Facebook maybe more so. But in that like regard, I actually think that it's the sub-communities within these platforms that we should really be focusing on when we talk about pop culture. Like a great mainstream example is like Pantsuit Nation, in my opinion. Like that's on the Facebook platform, but they have their own rules, they have their own norms, they have their own community that finally use the tools the way they want it to be.
Well, there were really quickly developed tropes that evolved for posting in Pantsuit Nation. You know, in the lead up to the election, you had pictures of people going to vote early with their kids. In the aftermath of the election, you had people posting sort of tense stories about confrontations with Trump-loving family members during the holidays. And so it was really interesting to see that group, which is large, I mean, it's millions of people at this point, develop its own sort of narrative forms fairly organically and fairly quickly. So many posts, though. It was a little overwhelming.
Yeah. But that, wouldn't you say like that, those types of sub-communities on these platforms are more in the spirit of what we wish the overall platforms would be like?
Well, and that's, I mean, I think that's the big business challenge for Twitter, right, is that do you go with just user growth or user engagement? And going with sort of productive user engagement would probably mean shrinking the platform a lot, which if you get people who are more engaged and, you know, more, it's easy to target people by how they're engaged. It could be a more valuable advertising platform, but then I'm not Jack and I'm not making business decisions for Twitter, so that's up to them.
Another question I would ask is, we've all heard that 1984 is moving up the bestseller list once again. Everybody is sharing articles about what best encrypted messaging app to use. Do we see pop culture sort of going underground? Do we see the people who are trying to represent an opposition to the Trump agenda seeking other ways to more quietly share their art or create some sort of subgroups that are under the surface, that are not quite so easy to find? Do we see sort of oppression or self-censorship on some of these platforms?
So I think one thing I found kind of fascinating about the aftermath of the election is the rebranding of basic civic engagement as resistance, as sort of a rebellious act. And I don't know that that necessarily speaks to the actual, you know, safety and political climate in this country. Millions of people turned out for the Women's March. You know, people did not get arrested or beaten or cracked down upon. Some of that has to do with race and the fact that a lot of the people in the crowd were white women. But it does not suggest sort of a massively repressive environment. And I think it's great that people are, you know, I have held local political office and worked in local political campaigns. Calling your lawmakers, writing to newspapers, writing to corporations, all these things are, you know, sort of fairly basic civic acts, and they're not actually super rebellious or, you know, I don't think that they constitute a resistance, they just constitute basic engagement. And I understand the sort of, I understand the emotional context for that sort of branding, but it also is, you know, what's happening right now is actually proof that our society remains fairly open, that lawmakers remain at least somewhat responsive to citizens, even if, you know, Trump himself is kind of cloistered away. And so I think that there is a sort of branding question that's distinct from whether people are actually practicing greater security. And I think it's very fashionable to talk about using encrypted email. It's not clear to me that Americans en masse are switching over to these services, and frankly, given everything we know about sort of data breaches and privacy promises, I don't have enormous faith in sort of private encryption services. So I feel like that the sort of encrypted communication stuff strikes me as more of a kind of a lead conversation trend piece than an actual major shift to the way that people are engaging civically and communicating with each other.
Would you agree?
I would agree, and further that a little bit to the point of, at one point or another, like, technology would have gotten scary, and it will get scary, whether it's AI or some other stuff, implants, thank you, water, brain implants or something that's going to happen that I think everybody collectively has seen in enough sci-fi movies to like be excited about when cyberpunk can come back as like a genre, as like an aesthetic. I don't know. Like there seems to be like our desire, self-fulfilling notion that like, okay, and then what's that Harrison Ford movie where there's artificial people? Blade Runner.
Blade Runner.
That like that is a possible future that we live in, for example. I think that all the people who wanted there to be a cyberpunk future or who like wanted to express themselves that way, that group at least are jumping on right now because of the security concerns, because of the cyber, because of privacy, things like that.
But I think a lot of folks in highly technologically engaged communities were using a lot of those safeguards long before the Trump administration.
And I mean that more from like what is the narrative that we're talking about, like when people are speaking about like the climate, the atmosphere, like privacy now and things like that. I don't think that it's going to change how average people or even not average people go about their days or go about expressing themselves. But I mean, somewhat related to this, like we have seen fringe groups that, for whatever their beliefs, technologically or race-wise, whatever, the whole spectrum, fringe groups are now maybe not in the mainstream, but have mainstream visibility. And so I think that there's other fringe groups that are forming either as a reaction to that, or just to simply fill that space of being not in the mainstream. So I think there are going to be sizable, over time, groups of people who are very secretive, who are having underground exchanges of ideas, and who are sort of proud of being that cyber resistance in a way. But
I think we're in a moment when perspective is really difficult, and I go back and forth on this myself. If you want to get really paranoid, there's a website that will show you the blast radius of various, megatons of nuclear weapons. And so if it's very easy to convince yourself that if there's a world war, we're all going to be incinerated really quickly, and so do with that what you will. It's also possible to look at the administration and say, it's basically going to be constrained, Trump's cabinet are not going to let him push a button. You can look at the administration and see a playbook for sort of eroding public trust in the press, which is obviously something I care about a lot. I work for the Washington Post. Or you can see a group of people who are up against a bureaucracy that they thought was going to be simple, but that in fact is incredibly hard to wrestle to the ground. And so, you can see what's happening as a rebirth of civic engagement and the fact that it can happen in public, and as a sign that we may end up being fairly healthy as a democracy. Or you can look at what's happening and say that, this is a resistance in America is about to become a much more radical place. And I don't necessarily feel like I have the certainty to guide anyone through those choices and say this is definitively what I think is happening. But I think that makes for a very schizophrenic sort of emotional and cultural response to what's going on. And that, it makes it a very interesting time to observe and write about. But also as a critic, I feel like I don't entirely always trust my own judgment and my emotional response, because the possibilities are, the range of even remotely plausible possibilities is extremely wide and extremely unnerving. And so I think that affects, questions of who actually adopts security. What does it mean that we see the kind of civic re-engagement that we have? So it's sort of it's a strange, uncertain time.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I'll open up the floor, so get ready with your questions. You brought up the subject of if it's a pop culture presidency, or the press conferences, elements of pop culture. Where is if this was a Venn diagram of sorts, would we see a relationship between pop culture, truth, the way the New York Times tries to present truth as the ultimate goal, and political correctness, which has seen a huge pushback? Do we see political correctness changing pop culture, or pushback against political culture?
How are you defining political correctness, and what's your impetus for using that term in the
however
first place?
you'd like to define it. We've seen so many images that people will take issue with because they're not politically correct, or they could be offensive to certain groups of people.
I think that politically correct is a term that is almost never used by people who are doing or advocating for the things that are ultimately described as politically correct. So, I do think that, we're obviously in a moment when there are debates about sort of how broad the range of acceptable speech should be. What are the obligations that we have to other people? I mean, I think in as much as there are people on the left who suggest that sort of all emotional harm should be avoided at all costs, you have people who are sort of nominally on the right, or maybe even sort of free-floating politically, who have made a fetish out of sort of inflicting emotional harm on other people. And so I don't particularly find political correctness to be a terribly useful framework, if only because it doesn't describe, there's not an agreement on what that term means, and it is a term that in itself sort of is a critique rather than a neutral description. So sorry, I don't mean to go on a huge tangent about that, but I do think that part of what we saw in this election was a pushback against what the anthropologist Arlie Hochschild described as sort of feelings rules in her book Strangers in Their Own Land. It's a book that I have some issues with, but she is essentially doing field interviews in Louisiana and a lot of her subjects say that they feel constrained or sort of pushed by people who tell them that they're supposed to feel a certain way, or feel sorry for a certain kind of person, or not merely support certain kinds of policies, but sort of embrace moral implications behind them. And I think that Donald Trump's presidential campaign was liberating for a lot of people who didn't want to be told what to feel anymore. And I don't think it's a sign of health in a movement if your entire shtick is essentially, they don't like it, so I like it. I don't think there's a lot there. I don't think that makes for a sustainable political coalition long term, but I think that was a powerful cultural element of it. I mean, you look at things like people freaking out about the fact that Trump orders his steaks well done and eats them with ketchup, right? I mean, steak is steak. You can eat it however you want to eat it. I cannot convince myself that there is a moral implication to burning your steak. It's not how I like to eat my steak, but I also don't like steak tartare, and I don't think that that makes me a failed cosmopolitan. I just think it makes me someone who doesn't like the texture of raw meat. And so, we're in a weird space culturally in terms of what's defined as elite, what's defined as desirable, when sort of elite culture and maybe what's desirable are diverging in ways that present challenges to both high art and the sort of elite end of the pop culture spectrum. And so I think there's too much going on to be summed up as sort of mere political correctness. It's far more wide-ranging and emotionally complex than that.
And for you, a question, since you do work with brands, do you see brands feeling a certain pressure to engage in virtue signaling, or choosing sides, or pushing back against certain types of agendas, like we saw the tech community in a very rare step come together and sign this letter against the ban, which is something they very rarely do. They very rarely agree on something well enough to sign a letter about it.
Yeah, on my end, the tech sector is only going to do stuff like that when it's just black and white, explicitly something that is right or wrong. As you've seen with the big cabinet meeting with Elon Musk and all the heads of the other companies, they still need to play ball. And playing ball means, with a president that's highly volatile, if you say or do something that can be misinterpreted, you're cut out. So it's better to take some flack from your users or constituents, because they are politicians in their own way, and to actually be at the table. But like what I'm seeing, nobody knows what their plan is because things are still shaking out. And as far as any intent to virtue signal, I don't get to be in the boardrooms with the SVPs of marketing for the big brands because they will not trust an agency with that stuff unless they're hiring a political consultancy or a lobbying firm. They at least haven't gotten to a point where that needs to happen. But like, I think that collectively, like, you know how you can date things by when the first nuclear bomb went off, there's a little mark in the carbon dating. I think that as far as creativity, art, culture, things like that, there's always going to be the Trump mark, which is like the blip where we didn't know what to do or weren't confident about how to say it because we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. So like, I think we're between that. Maybe in 3 years, we'll stop listening to the everyday ebb and flow and have our plan. But right now,
I was going to ask you what you thought about the retail response to Ivanka Trump's lines, because part of what was striking about that for me is it suggested that, I mean, if you look at a brick and mortar store like Nordstrom or TJ Maxx, the sort of willingness to drop her and then the surprise at some of the backlash suggested that they just have much less fine-grained data on customer preferences and attachments to brands than someplace like Amazon would. And totally irrespective of, you know, whether or not that was a good move for those brands, whether the virtue signaling sort of outweighed the outrage, it was just interesting to me that they could do it at all and that there'd be that sort of fuzziness there. It just seemed like an indication of some of the weaknesses in that retail sector.
But at the same time, I think they sort of they quietly did it and never really explicitly called it out and like stood their ground when they needed to, but like they just wanted it to go away.
Yeah.
I think they just wanted to pull out as quickly as possible from any discussion. And I think that they probably did some projections about sales and probably figured it wasn't going to make too big of a difference. At least not like they claim that the line is performed poorly, at least in that specific case. But I think a lot of people just want to be like, I don't want to, like, I don't want to address any of this. I want to do what I'm doing and sell my stuff.
But that speaks to your earlier point about how everything is political. So even pulling a failing line is now considered a personal affront to the president instead of just something that's based on internal data.
Having an event that celebrates your independence at Trump Hotel is considered currying favor with the President of the United States, which everybody said absolutely not. Like they said, we explicitly do not support this president and his policies, but we wanted a new venue. So it's all politicized.
All right, let's open the floor to questions. Who's got one? Over here. Yes.
With all the
Could you introduce yourself also? Thanks.
Morgan.
Okay.
With all of the sort of fake news furor and the not like that. And the I guess difficulty in measuring things. Bots or sort of any other augmentation of either users or trends in culture, not only for creating but for also looking at it objectively later. Do you have any thoughts or anything on that?
Can you be more specific about what you mean?
So a bot will create a hashtag and then it'll start spamming it, and it becomes something, even though it wasn't really something that people were interested in. There was maybe one person or a group of people that sort of created this thing.
Russians do it all the time.
Right, but what's the question? Like, I understand the
I didn't have
phenomenon.
anything specific from that, but if there's anything sort of.
I mean, I would start with, like, I've been reading a lot about this, so I'm not an expert, but I've read a little bit, like, the idea that, like, Reddit, one of the major providers of news and memes and stuff like that, one upvote amplifies one story's reach by about 100 times, right? So, and then people have been trying to game the system, and a couple people tried to expose Reddit specifically and saying, look, I could pay a company to do a focus campaign and bring a fake news story to the top page of that subreddit. That kind of stuff has been happening, and I think will happen, and we, like, the fakeization of, like, what's popular and what's true, and the gaming of the system, I guess would be the proper way to do it. Like, that was going to continue to happen. I guess it's happening, and it's going to keep happening more, I think. I don't think we're going to see a crackdown in fake news that's effective in the near term, or at least fake news shifting where you look away, distract away from the main issue with another story.
And I guess as a critic and not a technologist, the thing that's more interesting to me is not necessarily where something comes from, but if it takes off, what appeals to it about people. I was writing a column today about the extent to which the women in Donald Trump's personal and professional life are sort of the target of a lot of projection and kind of made-up stories. And I know that a bunch of the mainstream gossip publications have done stories sort of speculating about whether they'll get divorced. And so I Googled Melania Trump divorce to try and find one of them just for a link. And the thing at the absolute top of the Google search results is a fake news site, reporting straightforwardly that they were preparing to divorce, and a couple different iterations from the same site, and then a story about the fake news story. And so part of what's interesting to me there is that clearly there is a strong interest in the prospect that the Trump's marriage will break down. That could speak to any one of a number of impulses, but clearly that's something that people are really fascinated by the possibility. And so I'm more interested sometimes in the fascination than in the origin. And obviously the origin is a huge public policy problem and sort of public knowledge and engagement problem, but the what about it resonates question is always something that really sticks with me, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Maya. I'm a correspondent with Deutsche Welle. I have two questions, if I may. The first was, you had said that Trump's presidency is now operating more along the rules of pop culture than anything else. What are those?
Sure. I mean, I think that there were a couple of great articles written during the campaign about how he acts like a professional wrestling heel, for example, someone who is popular by being sort of provocative and negative and sort of saying outrageous things. So I think that's one really good example. The, reality television in general is just a great model. So if you look at, a show like The Apprentice or the Bachelor franchise exists by kind of keeping contestants on their toes. And so I guess you could call Trump's cabinet kind of a team of rivals cabinet, but it's also one that's kind of engineered to produce uncertainty and rivalry and insecurity in a way that, kind of makes for dramatic stories. I don't know if that's intentional or that he enjoys it, but it's certainly a management style that plays in some of the same ways as reality television production. I think he's very focused on the news cycle. He's not sort of a long-term thinker, and so to a certain extent, the presidency is like episodic television, right? It's like every day you hit the reset button, there's a new drama. Trump's tweets are almost the equivalent of the discovery of a body in a Law & Order episode, right? It's like they're the event that kicks off the rest of the action. Not that they have the same impact, being completely clear about that. I'm not saying the president's tweets kill, just that they are the sort of inciting incident in the day's news cycle. And so, it's not necessarily literal or intentional, but I think that sometimes those tropes are more useful for understanding the emotional dynamic of the presidency than considering it. It's not he's modeling himself on James T. Polk or K. Polk. Sorry, I should know better presidential trivia. But I think that's there's this sort of drama-driven dynamic where all of the management so far has seemed much more focused on kind of the news cycle and emotional impact than on sort of a long-term grand strategy.
If I may, my second question. You had spoken to how sort of everything these days has become politicized, from art to just everything. Speaking from anecdata, it seems like people don't really want they don't want politics to be part of their everyday life. They don't want it to be part of pop culture. They don't want movie stars to be giving political speeches when they accept an award. Is it possible that this cycle of him just infiltrating everything and everything that we see and do could make people tired of him and make people want to pay attention to him, and either, I guess, make him stronger because people will be paying less attention to him, or make him more frustrated because they're not paying attention to him?
Yeah.
I feel like that could go either way. But.
Yeah. It could go, I think, both, and keep balancing. Like, we are going to get tired of him one way or another. Like, that's going to have some effects, whether it's normalization or finding another way to emotionally communicate with the Trump administration that's not looking at his tweets. I used to look at him every day, now I look at him every other day. In a month, I'll look at him once a week and sort of summarize them in my head. Like, that's gonna happen. But to me, the difference, whether it's left or right or other people, like, everybody's gonna engage with it on some level, but I think it's the levels that vary. So for instance, I don't think people are, I think everything's going to continue being politicized, not because people are passionate about party politics or Obamacare and things like that, but because right now fundamental issues of existence and identity are questioned and are central. They have been in our country for forever, but now more so than ever. So it's like some people don't care that the President of the United States said, I'm going to grab him by the pussy. Some people don't care because they look past that and they say, well, he's going to get me a job. He's going to talk like a guy, but I can overlook that. Some people look at how Kellyanne Conway sits on the presidential couch with her heels up on the couch and clutch their pearls and say, that's disrespectful to the office. Or, remember what Republicans said about Obama. Those are issues of depth and what people translate to, but when people buy shirts that say nevertheless she persisted, that is a political statement that's not about Donald Trump so much as it is about feminism and rights and things like that. So I think as long as the things that we've made progress on or want to make progress on or don't want to make progress on are in the national spotlight, not so much what Trump says or how he says it, we will continue to have everything from art to clothing to culture to it's just every goddamn thing be politicized by the nature of it.
And if I could just, sorry,
Yeah.
I would add a couple of things. I mean, just first from looking at the internal traffic statistics on the Washington Post, people are super not bored of reading about Donald Trump. It is astonishing how focused our audience is on the administration right now. So there's clearly, I think, still a very high appetite for that sort of content. The second is that part of what we're seeing in culture right now that has nothing to do with politics and more to do with the business model is an incredible fracturing in the media landscape. There are essentially no mass sort of media spectacles right now. And so one of the ways of defining a niche is politics. And so, yes, there are some people who don't like hearing movie stars give political speeches at the Oscars, and there are some people who absolutely live for that right now. They're, like the racial politics scandal are inextricable from that, that show's soapiness as part of its appeal. And so I think that there actually is a considerable appetite for politicized pop culture. It's just that the people who want to watch that may have things that are specific for them. The people who don't want to watch politicized pop culture have the entire lineup at CBS to a certain extent. And then finally, sort of socially responsible advertising or branding that's not strictly partisan has been hugely popular. I mean, there's a new brand of tights that is advertising itself in part by using transgender models and suggesting that, like, the tights still work no matter what your genitals are like. There are a lot of companies that are following sort of the Tom's model and making contributions or sort of giving equivalent products to people in other countries. And there's, that's not a new phenomenon. Sort of socially responsible business has been a huge model for decades, and I think it's only getting bigger. And so it's one thing to say that people don't want their pop culture to be partisan, but it's very different from saying they don't want their pop culture to be political. Mm-hmm. And I think there is still a hunger for that. Also, frankly, if you want your pop culture to reflect a certain kind of if what you want to see is, shows about nuclear families where the dad is the dominant figure and works in a blue-collar occupation, that's a political preference, right? That's not a neutral position. That is wanting a certain kind of politics in your pop culture, but for some reason, it's only when people want their pop culture to be diverse or to have women as leads or to be honest about the fact that women have abortions that that's considered some sort of a political preference or a show getting political, if that makes any sense.
Would you say that before the election, there was sort of a pop cultural war between those who found icons that were Hillary-esque versus those who were on the Trump side?
Well, yeah,
did it skew a perception of how the election would go?
America has essentially been in a state of cultural war since the country was founded, and so we have mass media that broadcasts it more widely. But yeah, Hillary Clinton has been a pop culture avatar for decades, whether it's something very explicit like Primary Colors or something a little bit more diffuse like The Good Wife or Greg Berlanti's Political Animals or CBS's Madame Secretary. So, I don't know that there were a lot of sort of Trump-like icons in pop culture before the election, but Hillary herself has been sort of an extremely flexible cultural meme for 2.5 decades.
In the back here. Hi, my name is Jordan, and I'm not anything to do with the news at all. But I'm just social psychologist, so I'm just interested. Where do you think the news, and especially the mainstream news, I guess, will be given Trump's hostile actions towards it? Like, where do you see yourself going?
Oh boy. I feel fortunate that the Washington Post is owned by someone who does not appear daunted by the administration and who is invested in us and appears to be committed to us, and I really appreciate that. Our traffic at the Post is up a lot. In the opinion section, we have one of the highest rates of converting readers into subscribers, so I think one thing I find really heartening about this election is that readership numbers at a lot of papers have gone up a lot, at a lot of national papers, and so not only are people reading the material, but they seem to see the civic importance of paying for it. I think that we face enormous structural challenges as a business, and so to me, the continuing struggle to find a sustainable business model for journalism in a digital native world is probably a more substantial challenge for us than the administration. At least I hope it will continue to be that way. I think that bashing the media is incredibly popular. My husband is the senior fellow at Media Matters for America, so I have a vested interest in this, but he and I always talk about the fact that one of the things that Trump can do right now that puts him on the same page with mainstream conservatives is actually to bash the press, and so attacking us is as much a strategy for him as finding ways to sort of to maintain our independence and to articulate our civic function is for us. So I think that the number of newspapers and media jobs in America is going to continue to shrink, and I think that's a really bad thing, but I think that has a lot more to do with economics than he's in the White House.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, Phil Pauly with Respectability. And I want to shift subjects a little bit and kind of go with an orthogonal question. Your comment that we're in a moment now, we can't really see what's going on,
No.
right? So we think about Nixon, he said that history isn't fresh until it's 50 years past.
No.
And so what I'm wondering is, how will future historians look back on this era where so much is driven by social media content? Will there be a server farm in the basement of the Smithsonian with all of @real Donald Trump's tweets saved, where historians can go through and track how many got likes or how many got retweeted? Or how do you see us going back in the future and documenting?
Yeah,
the role
how do you do the
Twitter and
research?
Trump and everything?
That's a fantastic question, and I think it's really hard. I mean, one of the, I think people have a lot of worries about being surveilled, but one of the challenges about, sort of bulk data collection is how do you sort through it all, and that's a problem both for government and intelligence, but it's a problem for historians as well. I mean, if a lot of our politics is taking place on Twitter, where someone who is smart and influential might have 1,000 Twitter followers, where someone who is basically just really good at performing to the form might have 200,000, how do historians tell what's important? I mean, I think this is a real, have folks here read A Canticle for Leibowitz? It's a great piece of science fiction about monks in the future who, post-apocalyptic future, who have venerated as a holy text this thing that is, to any modern contemporary reader, obviously just a guy's grocery list, right? It's like Leibowitz's grocery list. And I think that we're going to have a real Canticle for Leibowitz problem for historians. How do you tell what's important? How do you tell what things actually are or what they meant? I mean, to go back to our conversation about memes, I have no idea what people 50 or 100 years in the future are going to make of the fact that there's this historical record where there is a Microsoft Paint cartoon frog everywhere. I have no idea how that symbol will be interpreted. I have no idea how a future Lin-Manuel Miranda will write a, rap history of the administration, because I don't know how to interpret it. But I think that's what really, I wish I had a better answer for you, because just the volume of material to go through is going to be really fascinating. And I also think part of what is sort of interesting and risky about the rise of sort of a conservative press that does not always hew to connect to kind of accepted professional levels of historiography is people who are working in the Trump administration may not have the inclination or feel the necessity of talking to whoever the contemporary David Halberstam is, right? You're not necessarily going to get the, frank conversations while people are still living with, politically neutral, respected mainstream political scientists and reporters, and so the accounts that are passed down may be filtered through, an obviously partisan publishing press. And so, yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but that is something, that's fascinating. That's a great question.
I have a tiny add-on to that just jerked the conversation wheel sort of back to the idea of culture and art and things like that. Some of the biggest hallmarks of our cultural history are magazine covers, whether it's the New Yorker or Time and who's been on what. I think that, I don't know what the hell we're going to be judged by, whether it's a major incident or a bunch of small ones that have no remarkability, or what's going to happen in 4, 10, whatever billion years. But I do think that the covers that are coming out now, that are now, magazine covers are cool again. They're now animated, they're now irreverent or super beautiful or just crappy, but they all have a message. I think people are going to look back on those at the very least and look at, you know, Trump beheading the Statue of Liberty, or X and Y, and look at how different, I think that they're a different crop than they have been in recent history, and I think that at the very least will help define at least the mood
Well, it
that we
feels
have.
spiky and graphically interesting again.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Hi, I'm David. Trying to distill this quickly. I'm going to challenge you all to replace the word pop culture with entertainment, because that's what I have come to believe has happened. And I'm going to try to do this really quickly. A year ago or so, I'm retired. I retired about a year and a half ago after 31 years as a Foreign Service officer. And so I started writing, and I have a little blog, and I wrote a little thing about, this is well before the nomination, that Donald Trump is a reflection of Americans' interest in entertainment, and specifically sitcom characters who get away with things. Forget about that, for what that's worth. And that was driven by some frustration on the part of my own family. I have a geeky family that doesn't know a damn thing that I care about. Because they spend all of their time, I mean, a kid who's graduated from college, a kid in college, a college-educated wife, and they spend all of their time, as I contend many of us do in our society now, pursuing entertainment. The next thing you brought up is the press briefing a function of an element of pop culture now? Right. So that's sort of exactly a big part of my career, was doing press briefings. So it's like before the band was popular. There was an element of pop culture that cared about those sorts of things, but it was a very small thing. So now we have a convergence of a political light, a political interest, and I'm going to say entertainment, not pop culture. And that's what I want to hear. What about this convergence of what has happened to our country is more everybody pursuing entertainment than it is the other way around?
I think it's a really tricky proposition to argue, just because if you look at among the things that the fragmentation of the television landscape has enabled is, you know, shows like Girls or Louie or, you know, even the first season of True Detective, what that, you know, are bringing, you know, very serious cinematic chops to television that are, you know, exploring sophisticated ideas. And so the fragmentation of the media landscape has actually allowed, you know, genres of pop culture that previously were sort of purely entertainment to aspire to be art in new ways. And so I think that
But nobody watched.
that's, I mean, that's not true.
Percentage.
Sorry?
Percentage-wise, very small.
I mean, but they exist at all, right? And so the idea that, you know, even something like Game of Thrones has, you know, brought in like very serious directors and developed an interesting house style. And yeah, that's a show where things get blown up and there are dragons, but there are, I mean, even Pulp has, I think, much higher aspirations in, so yes, maybe we have like a lot more Transformers movies than we used to have, but we also have much more serious artistic aspirations in other forms. So the idea that popular culture has uniformly gotten dumber or less artistically ambitious, I don't think is a supportable proposition. That said, I do think that you're totally right that something like the press briefing, you know, I think when Sean Spicer is sent out to effectively like give a performance and castigate various outlets, that is I mean, it's a political statement, but it's also meant to be sort of inflammatory and entertaining. And I think a lot of what Trump's appeal was just like, he's acknowledged this quite openly, is that he'd like to put things out there and see how people reacted, and then would keep saying something like lock her up. That was what people wanted to hear. So I don't think, I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, look, I think people like to be entertained. I think people like to be anesthetized. I think that's been a problem in American mass culture for far more than 5 or 10 or 15 years. But I think that the contention that you're offering there is so broad that it's probably not supportable given various trends in business, right? I mean, like, Amazon was a major backer of Manchester by the Sea. So you have these companies that are trying to appeal to the people who want to watch 15 Adam Sandler movies in a row, which Netflix effectively bought, and then are also, putting forward, something like Orange is the New Black is an intellectually serious show about prison and over incarceration in America that is actually watched by millions of people. So I think it's sort of unpredictable environment right now. I think the thesis is maybe a little bit overbroad.
If Donald Trump is the first pop culture president, do we take that to mean that if Sean Spicer is replaced by someone more serious, the press briefings continue to be an element of pop culture? Or could they sort of transition back into the more
Well, it's the performer
stuff?
in the role, right?
True.
So, yeah. I mean, and I think, look, the press briefing is always theater to a certain extent.
Sure.
Whether it's reality television or whether it's, really boring sort of what a novelist I know likes to call it sort of Irish art theater. Probably depends on the performer and the temperament of the president at the time.
Although even though it is entertainment, the fact that several news organizations were banned from that press gaggle sort of started a big discussion about favoritism and
Serious
things like that.
serious things happen in the entertainment business, right? I mean, for all that we're talking about the sort of transformation of American politics into fluff, the entertainment industry itself is a place that, employs hundreds of thousands of Americans, that has policies that produce wage discrimination and discrimination in who gets hired. The production of entertainment is itself a very serious business.
But I have a little baby thing to add on maybe ask to that. Which
Sorry,
is,
I'm talking too much.
No, not at
All
all.
the questions go to you.
Not at all. No. Progressive people, liberals, people on the left, they watch Trump and press briefings and they watch SNL afterwards. And they're entertained. It's a little bit of a spectacle. It's a little bit of like a sort of defeatist, like, God damn it, this sucks, but I'm going to laugh at it because it's ridiculous kind of thing. But like, what I'm reading and hearing is that to a certain extent, people who are Trump supporters look at the same thing, the same exact thing from the same exact angles, or the same exact dinner table and the same exact dinner, and they see something completely different. And I know that this is the whole Two Americas thing and all that, and I don't want to get into that, but like the idea that somebody might see Trump as a tall, straight shooter pushing away the bullying line press and really believing that, and doing it they admit he's doing it in an entertaining way where he's animated and not a bore, like some people accuse Hillary and Obama being. But they don't see it as having its own sheer entertainment value. I know that the question isn't necessarily that we're talking about, like, is Trump's cabinet supposed to be entertaining? But, like, that same shift, I think people looking at different levels of things, whereas, like, during Obama, the Pepe meme was also the same sort of, like, a defeatist, like, shrug, right? Now, people who don't support Trump, they look at him and they do a defeatist laugh. And they now people are more empowered to tell Hollywood celebrities who have culturally had the foothold on the media, and Hollywood have been at least perceived to have the foothold on defining entertainment, things like that. Now there is a lot more pressure just by the sheer empowerment of the Trump administration to say, get off the stage with your political opinions, go make me a movie I'm going to enjoy. And I think that, like, celebs are pretty stubborn people, some of them are assholes, and they're not going to back down, but I think that we will see, again, in this fake simulation in my head that's not a real simulation because it doesn't actually breed empathy, there's got to be some effect that, like, the shut up and make movies and stick to your own thing might have.
But the folks who say that are actually fairly well catered to, right? I mean, Netflix is literally giving Adam Sandler like a 10-picture deal, so
Right.
it's and that's one of the things that is both great and a little unsettling about the moment in pop culture, is that you can find something that will match your taste pretty much exactly, and that's tremendously gratifying, but it means that you don't necessarily have to sit with pop culture that is 80 or 90 or 70% of what you're really looking for, and then maybe 10 or 15 or 20 or 25% something else that makes you uncomfortable or makes you feel like the message that you're looking for isn't consistent. And so there's a lot less sort of struggling through and everyone finding something that they love in a piece of pop culture, and a lot more of us all getting to dwell in our sort of customized entertainment universes. And sometimes these universes are purely entertaining, sometimes they, you know, aspire to higher aesthetic value, but when it comes to pop culture, we can segment ourselves off pretty well, and then when we go back to politics, an arena where on the national stage there end up being two choices, we are forced to deal with coalitions and imperfections and impurity, and we struggle with it.
Any other, yes?
There's been a few pop culture examples of things that can bring together people from across the spectrum. Walking Dead, I think, it's been said is finding following from kind of both red states and blue states, and larger show.
Although the Trump campaign actually targeted it pretty heavily for advertising, the consumer research suggests that Walking Dead fans are much more conservative than your sort of average big television show. So,
rural?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
conservative and rural, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to. Just
No, totally, but also drawing huge numbers, just in
Yeah.
general. Do you see any of the opportunities or potential bright spots, or for pop culture that could be more unifying, or either shows that could kind of that have a bunch of stories that could rise, or just other untapped. Obviously you had these untapped ideas, you'd be selling them, but do you have any ideas for maybe kind of pop culture that could do more to unite?
I mean, one thing I would say is that it can be a little tricky to know when pop culture is serving as a unifier, because streaming services don't tend to release ratings data. So I have no idea how well anything that's airing on Netflix is doing, except as it sort of pings the cultural conversation barometer. So it's entirely possible that 10 million people have streamed one day at a time this remake of this great Norman Lear sitcom about a about a Latino single mom and her kids and her mother, played by Rita Moreno, who lives with her and helps provide childcare. That show has characters who come at every issue from a bunch of different perspectives. I wouldn't say it's straightforwardly liberal or conservative. It's just a really solid family show, and something like that. Maybe that's the show that's going to bring America together, but I would have no idea because I don't have the ratings data to prove it. I mean, I think the growth of ABC's family comedies has been really interesting. After Modern Family, they moved into creating shows like Blackish and Fresh Off the Boat that initially had strong African American and Asian audiences, but that have actually begun to draw larger white audiences the longer that they've been on. And I think people have started to catch them, in past seasons on streaming services. And so shows like that, where the average American family is no longer like The Bunkers, for example, could be something that's really interesting. Anything that, lets you live in someone else's head for a while. I mean, I think that this is probably going to ping your radar since it sounds like entertainment, but like I find the global success of the Fast and Furious franchise really fascinating. That literally was a story about a sort of like generic white guy deciding that he wants to gain access to this multiracial family and be a part of that. And that's, if you took shots during a Fast and Furious movie, every time someone says family, you would die. I don't care what your capacity for alcohol is. But, that franchise is hugely popular in the United States and runs totally counter to the sort of supposed racial climate in the United States right now, and so the persistence of something like that is really fascinating to me.
I don't think there's ever going to be a day where, in my personal opinion, the pinnacle of American cultural innocence was 1998 when Independence Day came out, where you had a movie where the lead was a babbling Jew and a black guy who was dating a stripper,
Yeah.
save the world. In hindsight, that's a really nice quip to make, but at the time it was like a normal movie,
Yeah.
right, from aliens, so like, saving the world from aliens. I think if a movie like that came out now, and they did try to do the second one, which sucked, but like, if a movie came out like that now, I still believe that people wouldn't care what the ethnicity of the lead is or like what their orientation was. Like, I don't believe that left, right, Americans, immigrants, etc., are inherently racist or any of those things, but they do have sort of predispositions, right? So I think looking at movies as like appealing to the left or right is like unless I think subject matter will appeal to left or right, like killing zombies with guns has inherent implications for people who like to like it, but then the interpersonal struggles of that show, for example, Walking Dead, are interesting to
Which was a very
other
diverse
people.
cast.
Yeah.
I should note, I mean, I think that the sort of snobbery about this stuff can run both ways. I would have loved to see more folks go see Deepwater Horizon this summer, which was sort of pegged as a, like, Mark Wahlberg does manly things in a Pete Berg movie, but it's actually just is a really smartly scripted movie about sort of expertise in business and who gets respected in sort of business climate, and, you know, without being sort of preachy about the Louisiana environment, like, places the like white working class guy who works a technical job on the side of the environment, and it's also, I mean, it's a really well done movie, and I did not see that get serious pickup or analysis among like anybody on the left at all, and I thought it was a huge shame because, you know, it's a solidly made sort of, you know, like disaster movie that sort of said some larger things, but I think people looked at it and was like, Wahlberg is kind of a meathead, and people were turned off by it. It was unfortunate.
Other questions? Let's talk for a moment about SNL. Do you think that the average Trump supporter sits through SNL and finds anything that appeals to them?
I will be honest, I am an old person, and so don't mostly sit all my way through SNL. I also grew up without access to television, or pop culture in general, and so never, I think, kind of missed the window when I got hardwired to enjoy SNL. And so I will watch and enjoy the occasional skit, but since I don't sit through the episodes, it's hard for me to speak to that.
Do you watch SNL?
I do watch SNL. I've watched it my whole life. Like, I think that now a Trump supporter won't watch SNL because Trump's spoken out against it. And as far as presidential mockeries, it's been the most vicious on Trump, whether or not that's because he's very easy to make fun of or because of whatever.
The brilliance of the Alec Baldwin impersonation is...
Yeah. His interpretation could actually be, his take on it could be interpreted as actually offensive. Like, if we were living in a more PC time, take over means, like, he's actually, his portrayal could be offensive to people with all kinds of predispositions, for what that's worth. So, like, but we're okay with it. So I think that SNL, I think everybody agrees it hasn't been funny the last decade, including Donald Trump. But it has so much cultural history in this country. Like, everybody remembers the Chris Farleys and the David Spades and the Phil Hartmans, even other people who are still living and stuff like that. Yes, I'm sorry. I was trying to name dead people, but David Spade's not dead. I wish he was.
David Spade dead?
No.
There we go. We're going to set him turning.
I don't think it's going to go away. This is an opportunity for an SNL renaissance, but that by definition will mean do the Trump opener, make fun of his twitchy face, and then do some other good comedy, because people are going to tune in for Trump.
And one of the things that's been happening just in late night in general is, you know, going political as a branding choice, right? I mean, it used to be that The Daily Show and The Colbert Report were this sort of slightly niche thing that happened on Comedy Central and that sort of took off and remains sort of a niche thing. And now you've got Seth Meyers doing it, you've got Colbert doing more of it, to the extent that Jimmy Fallon is actually sort of in this awkward position where by trying to stay politically neutral. And so that's part of the sort of nicheification of pop culture that we talked about. It's been a branding choice for a lot of late night hosts and a lot of late night shows, not just SNL.
And SNL actually is pretty well positioned to thrive in a social media age.
Oh, totally.
Because the skits are short and you can post them and view them sort of in isolation. You don't have to stay up and watch the whole show. Any other questions? Yes.
So people suddenly seem to like care about government data, for like the first time that I can really remember. And there's kind of this move to like protect it, and suddenly we have like alt National Park Service Twitter accounts, and then suddenly they're like part of the resistance, or I don't know, it's very interesting. my question is, do you guys see any places in government data that are possible sources for, you know, pop culture moving forward? Is anyone gonna care 3 weeks from now, or is this just like another meme that is gonna just float right on by?
It does make me wonder what would happen if Parks and Recreation were debuting as like a mid-season replacement right now, when people have been super into that. It's a fascinating thought experiment. I almost wish NBC would just start airing it again cold. You know, I mean, so I spent 3 years covering federal pay and benefits policy, so I spent a lot of time thinking about government bureaucracy. Pop culture has really struggled to do shows set inside government, and one of the reasons that Parks and Rec worked is because its approach to city government was so absurdist, and it picked, not that parks are trivial, I don't feel that way at all, but it picked, you know, just sort of this like tiny function of government, and a lot of the comedy came from the fact that the main character cared about that function of government in a way that seemed outsized, not just to everyone around her who was sort of apathetic, but to the viewing public in general. And so, you know, I mean, it's very easy to dramatize police departments, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security. I think it's harder to dramatize Health and Human Services or EPA. And so, I mean, and data is sort of the most esoteric part of that. I mean, it's the product of what those agencies do. So I struggle to think of a way that pop culture would feel very confident in doing that, but it would certainly be an interesting challenge for someone to try. I mean, yeah. I think one of the only successful dramatizations of federal bureaucracy that's not law enforcement is Pushing Tin, the Billy Bob Thornton, John Cusack, Angelina Jolie movie about air traffic controllers, which actually has an obsessive cult following among actual air traffic controllers. But that is, well, there's your piece of trivia tonight. Pushing Tin is accurate. But that's about the only successful example I can think of.
What about West Wing?
It's the political system, it's not the bureaucracy.
Okay.
I mean, it's not, people like the drama of politics, but it's very different from the actual function of the civil service.
If you ask in 4 years when we come out on the other end of this, hopefully, I guarantee you there's going to be the margin calls and like the equivalent of the Wall Street, like sort of the little baby steps and the little guys in the room. There's going to be that stuff about whatever transpires, the bureaucratic, whether it's a, you know, a happy story or a sad one, I don't know. But I think that we're going to see, I think the interest in government and the bureaucracy, which I think is a negative word, let's say the minutia and everyday life of it will increase over time. I don't think
minutia is also sort of pejorative, like the actual function of government.
Right, but I mean, let's say of actual agencies and entities and the individuals that are not the face.
Civil service, yeah.
Right.
The career civil service.
I think we'll see much more dramatization and entertainment-ness making of that a little later.
There will be a Sally Yates thing at some point. There will definitely be a Sally Yates. I don't know if it'll be a TV show or a web series or a Lifetime movie, but there will be a Sally Yates something. I will put $10 on that.
But at the rate that these things happen and sort of flash and then disappear, will people even remember who Sally Yates is in a year?
Oh man,
She'll probably run for office, so. If so, yeah.
Anything's possible.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. This has been a great discussion, and we hope to see you at future PS21 events. Have a good night.
Thank you.